She wasn't supposed to fall. Not Beatrice Langley. Not on Winston. But when her stirrup slipped and she hit the ground hard, the horse did something that made everyone freeze. He knelt beside her, like he was protecting her from a memory only he could see. The Pembroke grounds were golden that afternoon. Voices hushed as the announcer called her name. Beatrice Langley, just 15, but carrying herself like someone who'd already lived through too much. She entered the arena on Winston, her father's last chosen horse, a chestnut gelding with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. By the way, let us know in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. To the crowd, Beatrice looked determined. To those who knew her story, she looked haunted. Today marked exactly 5 years since her father died, found lifeless in their countryside stables. Since then, riding hadn't been just a sport. It was her only connection to the man who once whispered to horses like they understood English. The first half of her routine was flawless. Winston responded to every cue with fluid power. Beatrice's posture was perfect, her timing precise. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the harmony between horse and rider, a seamless flow that bordered on poetry. But as they approached the final turn, everything changed. Her left stirrup slipped. Her knee jolted forward, her balance tipped, and then she fell. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed through the stunned grandstands. Her helmet tilted on impact. Pain shot through her hip as she lay there, dazed and struggling to breathe. Officials began moving toward them. But Winston didn't bolt like any normal horse would. He stopped, turned, and walked slowly back to where she lay. With careful, deliberate steps, he lowered his great head and nudged her shoulder. Not out of confusion, but tenderness. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the massive gelding actually knelt, resting one front leg as if to be closer to her. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears as her trembling hand touched his muzzle. This wasn't just about the fall. Something about the way Winston looked at her, how he moved toward her with such purpose, stirred a memory she'd buried deep. As paramedics approached, she whispered something that would haunt her for weeks. He knew. Winston knew something, and what he knew would unravel everything she thought she understood about her father's death. Later, alone in the medical tent, Beatrice sat with a cold compress pressed to her hip. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight pressing on her chest. She couldn't shake the image of Winston's eyes in that moment. Ancient, knowing, almost human. Her trainer, Samuel Caro, stood beside her with arms crossed and jaw clenched. He'd seen many young riders fall, but something about this unsettled him. Not the injury. Beatrice would ride again, but the way Winston had behaved. Horses don't lie down, he said quietly. Not in the middle of an arena. Not with cameras flashing and people screaming. He reacted like, Samuel began, then stopped. Like a person, he'd meant to say. But he wasn't ready to voice that thought aloud. It wasn't just the fall, Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. When he looked at me, it was like he knew something. Like he was remembering something I couldn't. She paused, staring down at her hands. I had this image in my head. The day my dad died, I was in the barn. Winston was just a foal then, but he was staring at Dad's empty stall, still and quiet, just like today. Samuel didn't answer. He had his own memories of that day, and they didn't add up with the official story either. That evening, back at Rose Hill Farm, Beatrice found herself drawn to the one place she'd avoided for 5 years, her father's study. The door creaked as she opened it, dust dancing in the air like disturbed spirits. The room was exactly as he'd left it. Same brown leather chair, same cracked globe, same heavy oak desk, locked as always. She reached beneath the desk, fingertips tracing the edge until she found the small brass key taped underneath. Her father had shown her this hiding spot when she was 8, where he kept important things that shouldn't be seen too soon. Her hands trembled as she slid the key into the lock. Inside, she found yellowed papers, old notebooks, and one small leather-bound journal with her father's initials pressed into the cover. She held the book for several seconds before opening it. The first 2 pages were blank, but on the 3rd page, there it was. A line written in her father's familiar script. Winston is not just a horse. He remembers. The air in the study suddenly felt heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. What had her father meant? Horses didn't remember like people did. Not like this. And yet Winston had looked at her in that arena with something more than instinct. Something that felt painfully, impossibly human. She turned the page, heart pounding. What she found there would change everything she thought she knew about the gentle horse who'd been her closest companion, and about the father who'd died keeping his darkest secret. The journal pages weren't organized entries. They were fragments. thoughts scribbled between diagrams of horse anatomy and bits of poetry. Her father, Edward Langley, had always been a man of science with a poet's soul. One page read, "There are moments when Winston looks at me and I feel as though he's trying to speak, not with sound, with memory." Another, "He reacts to certain places as though he's been there before. But that's impossible, isn't it?" These weren't training notes. These were confessions. Quiet fears her father had never voiced aloud. Beatrice turned another page and froze. A name was scribbled there, Harold Finch. Beside it, her father had written, "If anything happens to me, he'll know what to do. Ask him about Rose Hill." About the day Winston was born. And the others? The others? Were there more horses like Winston? More secrets buried beneath the polite routines of country life? She'd always assumed her father died from an aneurysm. Sudden, tragic, random. But now she wasn't so sure. Why would a man worried about what might happen write this kind of message? That night, sleep wouldn't come. The journal sat open on her bed, Harold Finch's name circled in pencil. She remembered the name faintly, one of her father's old friends, perhaps someone from the early days at Rose Hill Farm. She rose just before dawn, pulled on her boots, and slipped out to the stables. Winston was awake, standing silently in his stall. His head rose as she approached. "You knew him," she whispered. "Didn't you?" Winston stepped forward, pressing his warm muzzle gently into her chest. It was the same gesture from the arena. Quiet, deliberate. Beatrice rested her forehead against his, her breath shaky. "We're going to find out the truth, you and I. No more hiding, no more guessing." She turned to leave, but as she stepped back, her boot caught on the edge of a floorboard, one that didn't quite sit flush. Curious, she crouched and pried at it. The board lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it, wrapped in old burlap, was a second notebook. Much older, stained in a way that made her stomach tighten. She hadn't just opened a drawer into the past. She'd pulled back a curtain on something far deeper, and this time, she wouldn't be able to close it again. The second notebook smelled faintly of hay, old paper, and something more metallic, something unsettling. Beatrice sat on a hay bale in the dim light, her hands trembling as she untied the twine that bound it. The first few pages were written in a different hand, sharper, more rushed than her father's, and dated nearly 16 years ago. At the top of one page, in bold, uneven ink, she saw it. Project Ashmore, she read in silence, each word pulling her further into a reality she hadn't known existed. The notebook wasn't personal, it was technical. Like a field report scattered with observations, diagrams, and odd language that reminded her of military shorthand. There were mentions of adaptive memory, genetic familiarity, and a recurring phrase that made her skin crawl, emotional carryover between cycles. Beatrice couldn't make sense of it all. But one thing became clear: Winston, and perhaps other horses like him, had been part of something larger, something secret, and somehow, her father had been involved from the very beginning. Harold Finch's name appeared halfway down a page, listed as handler initial conditioning phase. That confirmed it. Finch hadn't just known about Winston, he'd helped raise him, maybe even trained him before her father brought the foal home. Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned any of this? And why had her father hidden this notebook under the floorboards, not in his desk? The choice felt deliberate, as if he'd known that someone someday would come looking for answers. At breakfast, Beatrice confronted her mother for the first time in months. "Mom," she said, laying the notebook on the kitchen table, "did Dad ever talk to you about Ashmore, or a man named Harold Finch?" Margaret froze mid-pour, tea sloshing slightly over the rim of her cup. The color drained from her face before she composed herself. "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. Why would he? But her hands told a different story, trembling slightly, unable to steady the cup. Later that day, Beatrice pulled out her laptop and typed into the search bar, "Harold Finch plus Rose Hill Farm." Only one result came up. An obituary, not for Harold, but for his wife. And in the small photo attached to the memorial page, just behind the grieving man in black, Beatrice saw young Winston standing in the background of the funeral. The photograph was dated 10 years ago. But Winston was supposedly only 6 years old. How had a horse born at Rose Hill 6 years ago appeared in a photograph from a decade earlier? There was only one place that might have answers now. Ashmore Village, a remote hamlet 30 miles west of Wiltshire, nestled at the edge of a forest with the same name. According to the notebook, Ashmore had once been a training site, now long abandoned. Beatrice didn't tell her mother where she was going. Instead, she left a note and took the early train, the journals packed tightly in her satchel. Winston remained at Rose Hill, but she felt his presence as though he were beside her in the empty seat. The village was silent, wrapped in a blanket of mist that made the old cottages and dry stone walls look like relics from another time. Beatrice walked slowly down the main lane until she found the name she was looking for on a rusted mailbox. The cottage behind it was modest, tucked between two leafless oaks. She hesitated at the gate, her hands cold but her resolve burning warm. When she knocked, there was a long pause before the door creaked open. Harold Finch was older than she'd expected, at least in his 70s, but sharp-eyed, with a face lined by decades of hard living and silence. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You're Langley's girl," he said flatly, stepping aside. "Come in then." Inside, the house smelled of tobacco and earth. Faded photographs lined the mantel. Horses, riders, medals, and in several of them, again and again, Winston. But under different names: Regal, Ash Barlow, same eyes, same horse. "I've been waiting for this day," Finch said quietly, settling into a chair. "Your father knew it would come. He just hoped it wouldn't fall to you." Beatrice sat opposite him, notebook in hand. "I need the truth. About Winston. About my father. And about whatever they did at Ashmore." Finch took a long breath, then leaned forward. "The truth, girl," he murmured. "The truth is Winston's not on his first life." Beatrice stared at Harold Finch, waiting for him to explain what sounded like madness. Not on his first life. The words hung in the air like smoke, but Harold's eyes were clear. He wasn't confused, he was burdened. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Harold nodded slowly, reached into a drawer beside his armchair, and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the edges. Inside were old documents, reports, and photos. Some bore government stamps, others were handwritten in ink, so faded it was nearly gone. He laid a photograph on the table. It showed a younger Winston, or a horse exactly like him, in a military training compound, with Edward Langley standing proudly beside him. "Your father was recruited for Ashmore because he had something the rest of us didn't," Harold began. "He could connect with them. The horses, he believed, like I did, that certain animals carried memories stronger than we understood. Not just learned behavior, but something deeper. Emotional memory." Beatrice leaned closer. The horse in the photo had the same white blaze, the same intelligent eyes. "They weren't cloning them," Harold continued. "They weren't trying to build war horses or anything that dramatic. It started with a question: can memory pass through the body to the soul? What if a horse like Winston had experienced enough trauma, enough connection, that it imprinted?" He paused, watching her reaction. "Winston is one of the few that kept it. That emotional continuity. We called it echoing." Beatrice felt chills rising across her arms. She'd heard her father use that word once, in a dream, she thought. She'd imagined it, echoing. "But why keep it secret?" she asked. "Why didn't my father tell anyone? Why hide the journals?" Harold's jaw tensed. "Because the project went too far," he said bitterly. "Some wanted to push Winston, make him remember things no horse should, loud things, violent things. Edward pulled him out before it was too late. Faked the foal's records, brought him to Rose Hill, raised him from scratch. He thought the connection would fade." He looked at her grimly. It didn't. Harold reached for a final envelope, sealed and marked with her father's initials. "He left this with me in case you ever came looking," he said. Beatrice's fingers trembled as she took it. The envelope was thick, heavier than expected. She turned it over, broke the seal. Inside, she found a letter and a map. A red circle was drawn deep in Ashmore Forest, marked only with two words: final memory. "What's out there?" she asked. Harold didn't blink. "The last place Winston remembers, and the place your father never dared return to." The wind shifted as Beatrice stepped beyond the tree line of Ashmore Forest, the map gripped tightly in her gloved hands. The circle her father had drawn was deep within the old woodland, far from the bridle paths, far from where anyone rode or walked anymore. She had left Winston in Harold's care back in the village, but already she felt the pull of him, like a thread from her chest stretching towards something unresolved. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. The canopy above thickened with every step, as she followed the markings on the map, noting faded landmarks. A fallen oak, a crumbling stone wall, the remnants of an old path long overtaken by roots. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, eerily quiet. Like the forest itself was holding something. As she moved deeper, her thoughts circled around her father. Had he walked this same path, heart pounding just like hers? What had he seen that he never dared speak of again? And what had Winston carried from this place for so many years? After nearly an hour, she reached the clearing. The center of the red circle. It was more than just a patch of grass. It was scorched. The ground was blackened in places. The remnants of old wooden fencing lay splintered and half buried in soil. In the middle stood a rusted metal post, broken at the top, surrounded by shattered glass and fragments of leather harness. She knelt, picking up a small medallion. Military issue, engraved with the initials EL. Her father had been here, but something had gone terribly wrong. Images crashed into her mind like waves. Horses rearing, shouting, fire, sirens. Her breath caught and she stumbled backward. The sensation was overwhelming. Like a memory not her own had suddenly erupted inside her. She touched her chest, trying to steady herself. This isn't mine, she thought. This belongs to Winston. But somehow, through their years together, through every fall and brush and breath, it had passed into her. She was beginning to understand what her father meant by emotional carryover. Suddenly, she heard something behind her. A soft exhale. The unmistakable sound of hooves stepping over fallen branches. She turned. Winston was there. He had followed her, not with a lead or rider, but on his own. His eyes found hers across the clearing, and for the first time she saw it clearly, deep. Wordless grief, the kind that had lived inside her all these years. And then Winston moved, slowly, deliberately, to the center of the clearing. He lowered his head and began to paw at the earth. Winston's hoof struck the earth again, more forcefully this time. Beatrice stood frozen, watching as he scraped at the blackened soil, nostrils flaring, tail flicking with tension. There was something desperate about his movements, as if he wasn't just digging but uncovering. Beatrice moved toward him, heart hammering, and dropped to her knees beside him. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The soil was loose, disturbed. She began to dig with her hands, ignoring the dirt beneath her nails, the cold that bit at her fingertips. Only a few inches down, her fingers struck something solid. Metal, rusted and curved. She cleared more dirt, revealing a small, twisted fragment of a bridle still bearing the embossed logo of the Ashmore program. Just beside it lay a weathered leather pouch. Beatrice pulled it out carefully, brushing away decades of dirt and ash. Inside were several photographs, warped by time and moisture. One showed her father standing in this very clearing, holding a young Winston by the reins. But the next image stole the breath from her lungs. It showed another horse, identical to Winston, but injured and tranquilized. The back of the photo was dated 15 years ago, long before Winston was supposedly born. And then a name she hadn't seen before. Barlow's Cycle 3. Her father hadn't just rescued Winston from the program. Winston was the last of several cycles, each one a continuation of the last, carrying memory, trauma, and experience forward. The truth wasn't just that he remembered, it was that he had been reborn again and again into the same body, the same eyes. She looked up at him now, silent beside her. "You've lived through all of this," she said, her voice cracking. "Haven't you?" Winston lowered his head gently, brushing her shoulder with his muzzle. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't instinct. It was something older, something sacred. She suddenly understood the weight he had carried. The moments when he seemed to hesitate during training, or spook at places no other horse reacted to. Every hesitation had been a memory. Every pause, a reminder. And yet he had trusted her. He had come back to her again and again. Beatrice felt tears begin to well up, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming burden of truth finally seen. The wind stirred, lifting the edge of the map that had fallen from her pocket. The red circle was only one of 3 marked zones. In the lower margin, her father had written something she hadn't noticed before. "Winston's memory ends here. But mine doesn't." It wasn't over. There was still more to uncover. Not just about the program, but about what her father had done after it all ended. Beatrice rose to her feet, her hands dirty, her eyes shining. Winston stood beside her, calm again. Together they looked toward the forest, toward whatever waited in the final clearing. The path to the second red circle led them deeper into Ashmore Forest, where ancient oaks twisted toward a gray sky and moss covered everything like a shroud of forgotten time. Winston moved with purpose, now no longer burdened by the weight of hidden memory, but guided by it. They reached a low ridge where moss-covered stones formed the partial remains of what had once been a shelter. In its center stood a weathered stone pedestal, cracked and worn, with rusted bolts jutting from its top. Near its base, buried beneath years of leaves and dirt, Beatrice found another pouch identical to the one in the clearing. Inside was a bundle of letters, wrapped in wax paper. The topmost envelope was addressed in her father's handwriting. "To my daughter, if she ever dares to ask." Her hands shook as she unfolded the first letter. Edward Langley's words spilled across the page in ink that had faded but not disappeared. "Beatrice, I knew one day you'd come looking. I didn't want you to. I prayed Winston's memories would fade with time. But they didn't. And I see now, they never will. He was never just a horse. He was my companion, my test, my guilt, and my redemption." She read every line slowly, absorbing the grief and love woven into each word. Her father hadn't run from the program. He had tried to bury it, but he had never escaped it. The second letter was shorter, more urgent. It spoke of another man, Dr. Emery Quill, a scientist who had overseen the Ashmore experiments and who had opposed Edward's decision to shut them down. He wanted to push further, the letter read. He believed memory could be weaponized, even in animals. "The last known location of Quill is marked on your map, Ashmore Lodge, abandoned deeper in the woods." Beatrice looked at Winston, who stood watching her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "There's one more place," she said softly. "One more piece of your story, and his." Winston exhaled, almost like a sigh, and nudged her gently toward the path. They moved forward together, the forest growing darker around them with every step. The final path to Ashmore Lodge was overgrown, almost completely reclaimed by the forest. Ivy strangled the wrought iron gates, and shattered glass crunched beneath Beatrice's boots as she stepped through what remained of the entryway. The building had once been grand, a hunting estate converted into a research outpost. Now it stood in silent ruin, a skeleton of brick and timber. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust floated like ash in the filtered light. She moved room to room, guided by her father's final coordinates. In a locked drawer behind a broken desk, she found it a sealed metal case labeled Cycle Continuity, Logs Confidential. Inside were files, faded negatives, and a final letter. This one from Dr. Emery Quill, dated just 2 days before her father's death. "You were right to pull him out, but it's too late. The connection is irreversible. If you've kept Winston, be warned. He remembers everything, including the fire." Beatrice's hands trembled. The fire. She turned the note over. There was a small photo attached, a barn engulfed in flames. In the corner, a silhouette of a horse trapped and panicking, and standing outside, barely visible through the smoke. A man. Her father. This was it. The moment Winston had never let go of, the trauma that had embedded itself into every muscle, every twitch, every glance. And her father had never forgiven himself. Not for what he'd allowed, not for what Winston had endured. She walked back out to the clearing behind the lodge, where the foundation of the old barn still remained, now choked with weeds. Winston stopped at the edge, his body suddenly still. Beatrice watched as he lowered his head and stepped forward, not with fear, but with something deeper, release. She followed him, crouched beside the old stones and whispered, "It's over. You're safe." He forgave himself, and so can you. Winston closed his eyes. The wind shifted. A single leaf drifted past them, slow and soft, like a final breath. For the first time in years, perhaps in lifetimes, Winston's shoulders seemed to drop. The tension that had lived in his muscles, the watchfulness that had never left his eyes, began to fade. They stood there together in the ruins of memory, girl and horse, both finally understanding that some burdens are meant to be shared, not carried alone. As the sun began to set, they made their way back through the forest. But this time, Winston didn't walk behind her or beside her. He walked with her, as an equal, as a partner who had shared the weight of truth and found it lighter when divided between two hearts. That evening, they returned to Rose Hill Farm as the golden light cast long shadows across the paddocks. Beatrice stood at the gate, while Winston grazed peacefully nearby, no longer haunted by ghosts of memory, but enriched by the understanding of all he had survived. She held the last of her father's letters in her hand, still unopened, but she didn't need to read it anymore. She understood now. Her father hadn't just saved Winston from the program, he had trusted her to carry the truth forward, not with science or files, but with compassion. The letter could wait. Some secrets, once revealed, transform from burdens into bridges. Winston looked up from his grazing, his eyes meeting hers across the paddock. In that moment, Beatrice felt no weight, no fear, only clarity. The story wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. Her mother appeared at the farmhouse door, silhouetted against the warm light from within. For the first time in months, Margaret's face wasn't etched with worry, but with something that looked like relief. "Dinner's ready," she called softly. Beatrice nodded, gave Winston one last gentle touch on his neck, and walked toward the house. Behind her, Winston continued grazing in the peaceful twilight, no longer a keeper of traumatic secrets, but a guardian of healed memory. The wind rustled through the trees at Rose Hill Farm, carrying with it the promise that some stories, once told completely and with love, finally find their way to peace. And sometimes, that's exactly what both horses and humans need most, not to forget their pain, but to transform it into something that connects rather than isolates, something that heals rather than haunts. As Beatrice reached the farmhouse door, she turned back once more. Winston was still there, still watching over the land they both called home. But now his vigil felt different, not anxious or haunted, but protective and proud. The circle was finally complete, the memory had been honored, and the future, for the first time in years, felt wide open and full of possibility.